Yeah, this is great. Um, this is great, and she's right. This is going to be the last time. Um, I just I've been doing this for over 40 years, and while my ambitions coming out of college was something greater than this, in the end, this is what I love to do. You guys have been wonderful. I was trying to think about how many times I spoke here, and I've been speaking at the Solar Club before this meeting place probably 16 or 17 years. Not every year, but boy, you guys would bring me back as fast as you could. So this is it, and we're going to get right into it. And afterwards, no, I got a flashlight. Yeah, no, I want this as dark as possible. But if you want to help me, I forgot my mug with water. I might need that. So here we go. In 1978, 7 months after graduating from Michigan State University, I applied and was offered the sports editor's job in Juneau, Alaska. Uh-oh, just one second. When the editor offered me the position, he asked when I could start, and I told him my brother was getting married the next week. But right after that, I was jumping in my car and driving straight to Juneau. There was a long pause, and finally he said, "You know, you really can't actually drive to Juneau." Loading my car on the Alaska State Ferry in Seattle for a 3.5 day cruise to Juneau was my first indication that this was going to be a life changing adventure. The second was when I saw my desk at the newsroom. I had interned the previous 2 summers in the Detroit News Sports Department where they already had computers with word processing programs. At the Southeast Alaskan Empire, I had an old typewriter that was being fed by a box of paper on the floor. What really amazed me was the rotary dial phone. In 1978, in the capital of Alaska, they still were using rotary dial phones. I remember staring at that phone when the editor said, "Oh, by the way, you're also responsible for Thursday's outdoor page." I was totally unprepared for a temperate rainforest. From the day I arrived in the final week in September to the first week in November, it rained every day. Sometimes downpours, sometimes steady drizzles, but it rained every day. My third day there, someone told me to go buy a pair of Southeast sneakers, the brown rubber boots that every local wears practically year round. I did, and I don't think I took them off more than a dozen times that first year. Finally, in early November, the rain stopped and the sky cleared. The mountains around Juneau were stunning. So I loaded up my backpack and followed the Dan Moeller Trail into the Alpine until the snow stopped me. I pitched my tent and that night watched alpenglow spread across the peaks around me, and the lights of Juneau twinkled below me. I knew then this is where I wanted to be. 2 years later, I quit my sports editor's position because all I wanted to write about was the kayaking and backpacking and glacier trekking and the wilderness travel I had fallen in love with. A city you can't drive in and out of can get claustrophobic after a while. Approaching my third Alaskan winter, an Australian friend told me I would love New Zealand. I knew nothing about New Zealand, but I went anyhow. I landed in Auckland and jumped on the first bus to escape that sprawling metropolis. What I quickly discovered is that New Zealand was mountainous from head to toe. And not just the Southern Alps, there were mountains everywhere. I also discovered that New Zealand was an outdoor loving country. Like mountains, or because of them, there were tracks, what we call trails, everywhere. You never had to go very far to find a footpath leading from a road to the Alpine, so you throw your rucksack together and follow it for a few days. To us, this is backpacking. To Kiwis, it's tramping. And I fell in love with tramping in New Zealand. It was refreshing not to have to bear proof my camp every night like I did in Southeast Alaska. There are no bears in New Zealand. Actually, New Zealand had no mammals at all until the British showed up and introduced things like possums, stouts, and red deer. Doesn't mean that when you're tramping, you don't encounter a few large mammals here and there along the tracks, but they're fairly domesticated. And if you just keep your distance, they don't just all they'll do is stare at you. The other thing New Zealand doesn't have is snakes. And most unusual, it doesn't have anything that's poisonous, unlike Australia, where it seems like half the reptiles and insects possess enough venom to suddenly end your tramp. But there was one thing I quickly learned to avoid, something I never messed around with in New Zealand. Kiwis love to tell Yanks that Vegemite is just like your peanut butter. Don't believe them. It's a black bacterial extract with an incredibly strong odor and taste. It took me 20 years before I could spread it on my morning toast, and that's only because there was no peanut butter around. What makes tramping in New Zealand so distinct and such a wonderful experience from backpacking in Michigan is the country's hut system. Spread across New Zealand along every major track and a lot of obscure ones are almost 1,000 backcountry huts. They're generally spaced out every 4 or 5 hours, and some are capable of easily accommodating up to a couple dozen trekkers. And a few, like this one, the Kepler track, up to 50 trampers plus a night warden. Others are really small, maybe 4 bunks, and a tiny wood burning stove in case it snows that night. My favorite huts were those above the tree line that took you all day to reach. Your reward in the evening is a spectacular sunset over what looks like half the country. But if it's raining and the wind is howling, you snuggle in your sleeping bag and thank the New Zealanders for the roof over your head. The most enjoyable moments I've ever experienced as a backpacker was clearing the tree line in New Zealand and seeing the hut where I was bunking up for the night. There is no feeling like it in Michigan. I've probably been in New Zealand, probably 10 times, maybe 12. I get to think about that, to update my Lonely Planet guidebooks. All but one of those trips lasted 2 or 3 months at a time. And of all the tracks I've walked during my career in New Zealand, the Heaphy was my favorite. Located in the northwest corner of the South Island, the Heaphy is a 47-mile trek that takes 4 to 5 days. In 2013, it was designated and upgraded to a Great Walk, a collection of the country's premier tracks. They also established reservation systems for them. But in 2001, when my daughter arrived to hike with me, it was still a secondary trail that featured those small and cozy huts I love so much in New Zealand. A former gold rush route in the late 1800s, the Heath ignited the New Zealand conservation movement in the 1970s when the government announced plans to turn this obscure track into a road. The people won. And to a lot of Kiwis, hiking the Heath is something of a pilgrimage to their outdoor heritage. Jessica was a college freshman at MSU when she flew down to join me. I had 3 months in New Zealand. She had 3 weeks. Her Christmas break at MSU. Jet lag is always a problem for overseas travelers, but on the Heath, it can be particularly rough. Almost everybody starts the Heath at its north end, where almost all the elevation of this track is gained in the first half of the first day. Yeah, no kidding. But being young and only a year removed from her high school cross country career, Jessica rebounded quickly in the afternoon when the track leveled out. And when we reached the Perry Saddle Hut after a long first day, she thought it was the Hilton. It had benches and bunks and mattresses that were so inviting. On the second day, we crossed Perry Saddle itself, a subalpine area in the mountains. And at the beginning, the hiking was easy thanks to the old miners' road left behind after the gold rush. Eventually, it returned to a true track, and it wasn't long before Jessica encountered her first New Zealand swing bridge. Always an exciting moment. Then, 2 days later, we reached the original James McKay hut, a tiny little structure on the edge of the mountains that was incredibly comfortable despite its size and its age. In a bit of the clearing, it's located in a bit of a clearing on the edge of the mountains, and the views are wonderful. In the evening, we caught the sunset, and we could see the next day's destination. And I said to her as we were sitting out there watching this amazing view, I said, honey, we're going to, out there where the Heath River empties into the Tasman Sea, is where we're going to be spending the night on Christmas Eve. That's where we're headed. We began the descent out of the mountains and crossed the Heath River at one point on the longest swing bridge I've ever seen in New Zealand. There's places in America where they charge you a fee to cross a bridge like this. This one was free, and there was an awful lot of swinging on it. On the other side, we followed the Heath River through forests of Naku palms, all the way to where the river meets the sea. It was a surprisingly wonderful change of vegetation. And then we reached the hut. This is where we stayed on Christmas Eve, along with another New Zealand couple and a young man from Canada. The hut's long gone now. Haven't been replaced with one of those much larger ones like you saw in the Klepper, after the Heath became a great walk. I loved that old hut. Must have stayed there 3 times and off and on in my years down in New Zealand. I loved the fact that it was in a remote location you had to walk to over a day to reach it. And it was on the edge of the Tasman Sea. You can't swim in the Tasman Sea. Its tides and currents are far too violent. So we spent our afternoon beachcombing. It's really amazing what we could wash the shore. Then a half mile from the hut, as we were walking along the beach looking at things, I saw a small outcropping of rocks in the sea, but only about 10 yards from the beach. I stopped dead in my tracks. I smiled. I said, "Oh boy." The backside of that rocky outcropping, was covered with New Zealand's famous green lipped mussels. I waded in. With one arm hugging the outcropping, I used my Swiss Army knife, which back then we all had when we were backpacking. I don't know if people use those anymore, to dislodge a huge section of them. That evening, I found a clove of kind of fresh garlic, and we had a little bit of wine still, and we were drinking, and I paired them up with our last packets of cup of soup. It's the finest Christmas Eve dinner I have ever eaten. And then, after a rousing evening of singing Christmas carols with people we only met that day, Jess and I watched another sunset over Tasman Sea. And I said to her, "Tomorrow's our last day on the Heafy. And if we can get an early start, a early start and not fool around, we can make the Christmas Day buffet at the resort we're staying at when we're done." Yeah. Next day, someone gave me a shove in my bunk at like 6 a.m. I looked up and there was Jessica, and she said, "We are not missing that Christmas Day buffet." We were out the door in 15 minutes later. I don't even know if we ate breakfast or not. Watching the sunrise as we hiked along the Tasman. This is one of the most scenic stretches of track in New Zealand. It hugs the sea most of the time, but except when it occasionally dips into the forested bluffs that line much of the beaches. After the first 15 minutes, I never saw my daughter. She was that far ahead of me. Finally, I dipped in the forest and popped out at a large grassy clearing. Having hiked this trail a couple of times, I knew this was the other end. And there she was, patiently waiting for me. What takes most people 5 hours to walk, we did it in 3. From a courtesy phone at the trailhead, we rang up the resort and they sent out a van to pick us up. We didn't just make the Christmas Day buffet, we were the first in line. After that first winter in New Zealand, I returned to Juneau and guided another season for Alaska Discovery, what was then kind of nicknamed Act Disco. Eventually, it was absorbed by Mountain Travel, a large venture company in California. But back then, it was a great little company. All the guides were young and single because they only paid $125 a day, and that's when you were actually guiding. No health insurance, no pensions, no sick days. But the expeditions we did were amazing. Our bread and butter was half-day glacier walks across the Mendenhall Glacier near Juneau, where we served cruise ship passengers Mendenhall Madness at the end in souvenir cups with a big shot of rum and a little bit of glacier ice, and they loved it. We always got tipped well when we did that. But our forte was kayaking in Glacier Bay National Park. Glacier Bay is a 3.2 million acre park northwest of Juneau. It includes a stretch along the Pacific Ocean, the Fairweather Mountains, and part of the wild Tashnahini River. But its playground are the inner bays. We rented the kayaks to independent travelers, and we also ran guided trips for those who weren't comfortable doing it on their own. There were few cruise ships back then, not like today, and they always were restricted to the West Bay. The East Bay was for kayakers and now once a day turboat. And most kayakers utilize that turbo. They'd be taken up to the deep in the East Bay and dropped off, and then picked up 3 or 4 days later. So because then they can spend all their time paddling around glaciers and ice. It was while paddling the big water, though, from Bartlett Cove, which is the headquarters of the park, north, that I encountered my most incredible wildlife encounter anytime in my 40-year career. Paddling along, I spotted this. A humpback whale that had surfaced, I think, roughly about a half-mile away, but I saw it. I wasn't surprised. It's estimated that almost 250 humpback whales migrate to Glacier Bay during the summer. I stopped and watched it in fascination. It rolled a couple times and then, with a flip of its tail, disappeared. But it wasn't long, and I was paddling solo at this point. It wasn't long, and I knew where that whale was and where it was heading. Moving towards me was a clear patch in the rippled surface of the bay and an occasional explosion of air. I don't remember being nervous at the time. I simply put down my paddle and picked up my camera. And I watched this watery path move towards me through the viewfinder. Then, less than 15 yards to my left, this 40-ton humpback whale broke the surface. And my viewfinder went black. I instinctively shot this photo and was so excited or jittery, I don't know, I can't remember, but I couldn't advance the film. This is before digital cameras, by the way. I fumbled too long. I had to pull the camera down, and when I looked up, I missed the picture of a lifetime. The one that appears on the cover of Alaska magazine at least once a year. That huge fluke of the whale shaking off a rainbow of mist and water, giving one last powerful thrust that would send it to the depths of the bay. I must have sat in that kayak with the paddle over my lap for over 20 minutes, reliving that moment. Then I picked up my paddle and continued north. From the seat of a kayak, seeing a 30-foot-long humpback whale, no matter how far away you are, is what makes Glacier Bay so special. But what really captures the imagination of kayakers is the ice. There were 16 active tidewater glaciers when I was there. Now, because of climate warming, there are only 11, but 8 of them, like the Grand Pacific Glacier you're looking at, are located on the inside bays. There's nothing like it in Michigan. You carefully weave around the ice, especially if you're in a collapsible klepper that we used so often back in the 1980s. Or around the ice, carefully looking above the ice, above your boat to the ice. You can spend hours watching seals on the ice. They have their pups on the ice. You can watch them watching you at times. There are times when the ice literally dwarfs over you in your little boat. And there are times when you're sitting in a theater of ice, watching the power of the tide create giant icebergs right in front of you. Those are some great guided trips we did back then. The best happy hour I've ever enjoyed in the wilderness was on these guided trips when we'd go down to the tide line at low tide and chip 1,000-year-old glacier ice into our metal cups and then take it back to their clients. But in 1985, I was paddling solo, occasionally seeing other kayakers, but not often. One day I met the turbo in the East Arm and exchanged a plastic bag of trash for one that had more food, a couple of novels, and a handful of letters from home. One of those letters, and this was in 1985, was from my wife, and she said, "Oh, by the way, I'm pregnant." Then I continued around the point into the West Bay in an area of the park that had no glaciers, no ice, and no people. I went 12 days without seeing a person, a boat, or a float plane overhead. This was before cell phones or the internet. So the conversation I had was the only conversation I had was when I was talking to myself. I had gone 2 or 3 days alone in the wilderness before that, but nothing like this. The highlight I remember was day 6 or 7. I found a wayward crab pot like this one washed ashore. It's a recreational pot because commercial crabbers are banned from the park. It could have even been one from Alaska Discovery Trip. We used to use them back then. I set it up again and then looked in my food bag for bait. The only thing that wasn't freeze dried was my last chunk of hard salami. It was quite a decision and debate in my head whether to give it up or not, but I did. Boy, did that pay off. The next day I went out there, pulled that pot up, and much to my delight was a half a dozen Dungeness crabs in it. I cooked them all that morning, and that wasn't easy. I had a little pot, and I had to cut them in half and boil them one half at a time. But man, they were so good. I ate 3 that morning for breakfast, and the other 3 for dinner that night. By day 12, I was paddling up the West Arm, and I saw a small cove that looked like a perfect place to set up camp. I paddled into it, and much to my delight, there was another kayak already beached. I jumped out and ran up to the couple that were there with probably a pretty crazy look on my face, introduced myself, and then said, "You're the first people I've seen in 12 days." They looked at me, and the guy said, "We just got married, and we're on our honeymoon." It's honest God truth. It didn't matter. Spent the entire evening talking to him anyhow. Not even newlyweds had stopped me from rambling endlessly into the night. They never did give me their phone number or address, so I didn't keep in contact with them. In 1982, 8 months after moving back to Michigan, I boarded the Ranger 3 in Houghton, Michigan, to spend 2 months at Isle Royale. I had an assignment from the editor of the Detroit News Sunday magazine, but what I really wanted to do was write a guidebook for the park. In New Zealand, I was heavily influenced by Philip Temple. He's one of the country's most honored authors for his historical nonfiction novels, even kids' books. But at the start of his career, he wrote trail guides, no doubt to pay the bills. And I was intrigued how he wrapped history and nature, even his sense of adventure, into describing trails. The park officials at that time in Isle Royale were eager for me to do the same, but were caught off guard when I showed up with a kayak, a sea touring kayak. They said they'd only seen two kayakers the previous summer. Fresh from Alaska, I said, Isle Royale is sea kayak country, even if there are no kayaks here. It's going to change. It did. I needed to hike all the trails, of course, but what I really wanted to do was circumnavigate the island. I'm sure someone had already done it, maybe even in a canoe, but this was pre-internet and I couldn't find much information about it or how challenging it was. My first day was easy and scenic. I paddled down Rock Harbor Inlet to Daisy Farm Campground, the largest backcountry campground in the park, featuring 16 of those beloved three-sided shelters, which really haven't changed much since whenever. First time I went to Isle Royale in the 60s, and they had them then. But the next day I woke up, and I saw this. Yeah. Windy conditions and those scary Lake Superior waves crashing on the shore. So I sat tight at Daisy Farm for a rest day that was way too early for me. Tired of waiting, the following day I changed my plans. Instead of following the outside coast at Chippewa Harbor, I went inland and portaged twice to get there, two of the longest portages in Isle Royale. But I was smart enough to build a yoke for my kayak. Still, there's nothing glamorous about portaging. It's a grunt. In my case, it was really a pain because I had like 2.5 weeks of food with me with very little hadn't been eaten by then. But I hauled that first day, I ended that first day in Lake Ritchie, a wonderful spot that I love. It has a canoe campground, one of 4 in the park. You can only reach this, only paddlers can reach this campground. And you can camp and you pretty much have it to yourself. And then that evening you can go out and catch northern pike. It's wonderful for that. Still, after 2 long portages across the island, it was great to get back in the open water. Not only is kayaking an easier way to travel, but I quickly discovered the scenery was intriguing. Often a weather blend of Isle Royale history. There were old fish camps and abandoned boats. There's cabins and lighthouses. Even the remains of resorts that dotted the islands in the 1920s welcoming guests who arrived by steamship from Chicago. There are 3 very challenging areas when you circumnavigate the island, and there are ways to safely bypass all of them. The first for me was Siskiwit Bay. The inclination is to paddle across the bay, from the backside of Hay Bay to Fisherman's Home Cove. But that includes more than 3 miles of open water. The alternative is to follow a shoreline of the bay, but that's an additional 12 miles of paddling. I shot across the bay. But halfway across, I ran into some unexpected wind and waves, and I broke my paddle. At the end of the summer, I sent my article in 100 slides to Detroit News Sunday magazine, and this is the photo they selected for the cover. My broken paddle. My kayaking buddies still give me crap for that to this day. Luckily, I had a spare, so I pulled that out and swapped out the broken piece and continued on. My adrenaline was still flowing when I pulled into the quiet waters of home fish or Fisherman's Home Cove. Fisherman Home is a fish camp of several buildings that dates back to the early 1900s. In 1982, when I was there were still reels of drying nets and commercial fishermen that spend the summer there. And that building on the dock behind those nets was a sauna. And I was offered the use of it. I must have smelled really bad after a week and a half. You go in that building, you stoke up the wood burning stove and sweat out 2 weeks of grime, and then open the door and jump into the cove that's basically Lake Superior. You're not only clean, you're pretty mellow by then too when you climb out. And I was when I paddled out of Fisherman's Home. On my way to Wendigo, I also portaged my kayak into Feldman Lake. It's about a 0.8 mile portage in. I don't know how many people had done it that summer, carrying a boat into this lake. It would have been a rough place if you had a canoe. The 6 backpackers camped along the shore were delighted when I assembled my spinning rod and paddled out in the middle of the lake. The northern pike fishing was phenomenal, and everybody feasted on fresh fillets that night. At Wendigo, I stashed my kayak for a week to hike the area trails, wait for more supplies to arrive from Rock Harbor, and befriended a park maintenance worker who repaired my paddle for me. I was now faced with the toughest stretch of any circumnavigation of Isle Royal, the notorious wall. When a high pressure system settled in, I finally departed Wendigo. I paddled out of Washington Harbor, gliding gently over Isle Royal's most famous shipwreck, the America, whose bow is only 3 feet below the surface, and continued to Huggington Cove campground. I was on the water the next day by sunrise, when the lake is smooth and the wind is non-existent, because Huggington Cove marks the west end of the wall. Isle Royal's most treacherous shoreline that most kayakers need 4 to 5 hours to paddle. What makes the wall so challenging is there's no place to pull out for 9 miles. It's literally a rock wall. It's also located in the northwest corner, where strong winds often whip across Lake Superior before battering the island. Today, kayakers can backpack in lightweight weather radios and to pick up the forecast from Houghton or Thunder Bay. Back then, they weren't around. Instead, you started at the crack of dawn and you hustled until you reached the protection of Little Todd Harbor. Like Cisco Bay, you can safely bypass the wall. You load your kayak on the Voyager 3 ferry in Wendigo for a drop off at McCargo Cove. And the Voyager 3 is still doing this, running around the island, dropping kayakers off areas they don't want to paddle. McCargo Cove is a wonderful campground. It's also the gateway to the Five Fingers area of Isle Royal. And you get all of this from riding a ferry boat, the safety of a ferry boat, around the wall in the northwest corner of the island. The Five Fingers is a series of long, narrow bays and islands, many connected by very short portages, allowing kayakers and canoers to safely paddle this area of the park. I love it. The water is smooth, the paddling is easy. I've had some of my best wildlife encounters on at the park here because unlike a backpacker on a narrow trail, moose don't sense a kayaker as being dangerous or and rarely stop for what they're doing. Kayakers can do very well at certain times of the summer for lake trout by simply trolling spoons behind their boat as they paddle along. In 1982, I paddled into Crystal Cove and met Milford Johnson, Isle Royal's last commercial fisherman. Milford was still catching whitefish and selling them to the Rock Harbor Lodge back then. I loved talking to him. History, living history. And he was pretty impressed with me, my kayak, and my journey around the island. We really hit it off, and that when I went to take off from there, he gave me a whitefish. Fresh fish that dinner. I had been at the park maybe 6 weeks by then. God, it was good. It's a 25-mile paddle from a cargo cove to Rock Harbor, although you could spend a lot more time exploring the area. But getting around the end of the island is the third challenge for kayakers, Blake Point, the northeast tip of Isle Royal. It's an area exposed to a lot of wind. The waves are not only choppy, but they often come towards you in two directions. You can bypass the tip by portaging your kayak over the Greenstone Ridge, literally. Well, that's a brutal climb while carrying a boat over your head. I was resigned to portaging until a power boater in Duncan Narrows campground offered to tow my kayak around Blake Point. Yeah, this picture's kind of fuzzy, but you can see my kayak and the rope. Which begs the question, was I cheating? Did I truly circumnavigate the island? I don't know. But I've learned two things wandering the wilderness for so long. You can still eat well even if you're sleeping on the ground. And you always want to come back home at the end so you can wander another day. In the mid 1980s, a publisher offered me a contract to write my first non guidebook. It was an oversized coffee table book that contained a dozen of my essays and was surrounded by stunning photography, obviously none of it mine. The book never made it to its second printing. Neither did the publisher. They shut down 6 months after my title was released. I don't think it was my fault. I really worked hard on that. But I never wrote another hardcover non guidebook again. That was it. After my first children's guidebook to Michigan was released, Booth Newspapers, a chain of dailies, approached me about writing a weekly column entitled Kid Ventures. The first one appeared in August 1989, featuring 5-year-old Jessica camping's adventure on South Manitou Island. The column was an immediate hit with readers. At one point, ran in about a dozen papers. I realized all this the second year when I told the editors I needed a 2-month break to update my guidebook to New Zealand, and they asked me if I could stockpile 8 kid ventures before I went down under. I learned a lot hauling my kids across Michigan. I learned it can get really cold camping in Lake Superior even in August. To this day, I've never asked them if they were embarrassed walking around a campground with socks on their hands. I learned children do a lot more outdoors than what their parents think they can. I learned they absorb whatever you love in the outdoors. And I learned they grow up fast. The column ran for 14 years. That's an amazingly long time. but the kid ventures never really ended. In 2011, Michael was at his first job out of college when he had a week off and a free airline ticket for giving up his seat. I told him to meet me in Juneau at the end of my Lonely Planet research trip and we'll do a little alpine trekking. When he arrived in Juneau, we immediately jumped on the state ferry for Skagway to hike the Chilkoot Trail, not just one of the greatest adventures in Alaska, but in the country. The Chilkoot begins just outside of Skagway and winds 35 miles from the U.S. into British Columbia to Lake Bennett, almost in the Yukon Territory. Along the way, you climb the Chilkoot Pass and traverse year-round snowfields. The route was made famous by Klondike Gold Rush, which began in 1896 and was over by the 1900s. But in between, thousands sold everything they owned to finance a trip across the trail to the gold fields of Dawson City. In the winter of 1897 alone, 30,000 prospectors climbed the Chilkoot Pass, each hauling a year's worth of supplies as required by the Royal Canadian Mounties stationed at the top. The Chilkoot is just not an alpine trek, it's a walk through history, because the trail is littered from one end to the other with artifacts from the gold rush, from a giant saw blade and huge mining dredges to a rusty coffee pot on the side of the trail. Because of its popularity, you have to stay in designated campgrounds and reserve your site in advance. They limit the number of trekkers on the Chilkoot, and it's controlled by both the U.S. National Park Service and the Canadian National Park Service. But each campground has a warming cabin filled with photos of the gold rush and artifacts, where trekkers gather in the evening. Our first night, after a long day on the trail, we were playing cribbage when Michael said, "I brought some pain medication for us." He promptly pulled out a half pint of pretty good whiskey out of his backpack. I smiled and I said, "Michael, this is my third time over the Chilkoot, and I'm telling you, that's not going to be enough pain medication for the both of us." I pulled the fifth out of mine. It felt really good I could still teach my son a thing or two about surviving the outdoors. The high point of the hike is crossing the 3,524-foot pass. You begin from Sheep Camp, and the night before, a ranger arrives and gives a talk about trekking through an avalanche zone and the need to start early in the morning. Because the sun loosens up things by the afternoon. So Michael and I wasted little time. We were packed and on the trail by 5:35, as my evidence from my watch displays. Adrenaline flowing as we steadily climbed towards the pass. The final leg is the Golden Staircase. That during the Klondike was 1,500 steps chopped out of ice and snow. It's got to be one of the most famous Klondike photos you'll ever see. They shot it a lot, but it's just amazing. Those guys were climbing up there in this pass, and then they had to turn around and go back and get more supplies because they needed a year's worth. In the summer, it's a 30-degree incline of boulders and rusty cables left over from the gold rush that you struggle to climb on all fours using the cables that are 100 years old. This isn't a particularly high pass, but when you reach the top, that Klondike sense of adventure overwhelms you. And when a backcountry ranger, really a member of the Royal Canadian Mounties, comes along and says, hey, you guys are the first to cross that day, it's the most satisfying moment. Two days later, we reached Lake Bennett with its huge railroad depot, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. It was the White Pass and Yukon Railroad that put the Chilkoot out of business, made it obsolete. And when it was completed in the 1900s, today the railroad is a scenic train ride and the depot a huge dining hall for cruise ship passengers. But in the back, there's a room that they stick all of us who haven't taken a shower in 4 days. They serve us a Stampeder's meal, pots of beef stew with real beef, hot loaves of bread that you slather with real butter, and apple pie. Everything washed down with freshly brewed coffee. It's great being in that room. And after such a meal, you go outside and you wait for the historic narrow gauge train to take you back to Skagway so you can continue on your Alaska adventures. Backpackers, of course, get their own car in the very back because we still haven't taken a shower yet. In the winter of 1983-84, the first edition of Isle Royale National Park, Foot Trails and Water Routes was released. It was a thin book of 136 pages, hand-drawn maps, and fuzzy black and white photos. But it was the first paddler's guide to any place in Michigan. Jerry Dennis's classic Canoeing Michigan Rivers won't appear for another 3 years. It was really the first guidebook to trails in Michigan, as opposed to just a collection of maps. It's done well. This summer actually, that book enters its 40th year of continuous publication in various editions. It's the most satisfying achievement of my career for a park that's so small and has such a small visitation. But it meant a lot to me, so I went back as often as I had to. And recently I decided on this summer, on that note, I still had the creativity and energy and passion to finish other non-commercial projects, I was going to hang it up. I call it quits. That's why you'll never see me speak here again. I could spend an hour or more thanking all the people who helped me along the way. Starting with my wife, who I'll never understand why she agreed to marry an unemployed writer 40 years ago. But the people I need to thank the most are you. Everybody in this audience. Everybody I've met along the trail or attended one of my presentations. Everybody who has sent me hundreds of letters over the years and twice as many emails or Facebook postings. And most of all, everybody who purchased one of my books, had a great adventure, and then purchased another one. In the beginning, I didn't know if I would be able to make a living writing outdoor guidebooks. It was a pretty niche little slice of publishing. But thanks to all your support and encouragement, particularly this club, this is the only trail I've ever followed, a path of my own choosing. And I don't know how to thank you. I don't know how to show my deep appreciation for all that you gave me, except to say thanks. Thanks, and I'll see you on the trail. Thank you. If anybody's got questions or anything, I'd be happy to answer them. I'll be at the table for a while, and great Christmas gifts, and I seriously, Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Now that all the gym groupies are here, every month